The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty ranch land as Thomas Mitchell stepped out onto his front porch, coffee mug in hand. The drought had been merciless that summer of 1943, turning the once green pastures into cracked earth that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. His cattle moved slowly across the barren landscape, their ribs showing through their dusty hides as they searched desperately for patches of dried grass. Thomas had inherited the ranch from his father 20 years earlier, and in all that time, he had never seen conditions this harsh. The well water was running low, and he had already sold half his herd just to keep the remaining animals alive. His wife Sarah worried constantly about their finances, counting every penny as they struggled to maintain their livelihood in the unforgiving New Mexico wilderness. As Thomas walked toward the barn to check on his remaining horses, something caught his eye near the fence line that bordered the reservation lands. A small figure was moving slowly along the boundary, stumbling occasionally as if struggling to stay upright. Thomas squinted against the bright morning light, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The figure was a child, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with long black hair that hung limply around thin shoulders. The boy wore tattered clothes that were several sizes too large, and even from a distance, Thomas could see that the child was painfully thin. The boy was following the fence line, occasionally stopping to pick at something on the ground before continuing his slow journey. Without hesitation, Thomas set down his coffee mug and walked quickly toward the fence. As he drew closer, he could see that the child was gathering small berries from the sparse bushes that grew along the boundary. The boy's movements were weak and unsteady, and Thomas realized with growing alarm that this child was clearly suffering from severe hunger. When Thomas reached the fence, the boy looked up with large, dark eyes that held a mixture of fear and exhaustion. For a moment, neither of them moved. Thomas could see that the child's cheeks were hollow, his arms were little more than skin and bone, and his lips were cracked from dehydration. "Hello there," Thomas said gently, keeping his voice soft and non-threatening. "What's your name?" The boy said nothing, but he didn't run away either. He simply stood there, clutching a handful of tiny berries in his small fist. Thomas could see that the child was trembling, whether from weakness or fear, he couldn't tell. Thomas knew that relations between the local ranchers and the Native American community had been strained for generations. There had been disputes over land rights, water access, and grazing boundaries that had created an atmosphere of mutual distrust. Most ranchers and tribal members kept to themselves, rarely interacting except when absolutely necessary. But looking at this starving child, Thomas felt none of the hesitation that might have held him back in other circumstances. This was simply a human being in desperate need of help, and nothing else mattered. "Are you hungry?" Thomas asked, and he saw the boy's eyes flicker with something that might have been hope. "Would you like something to eat?" The child nodded slowly, still watching Thomas with cautious eyes. Thomas gestured toward his house, speaking slowly and clearly. "Come with me. My wife will fix you something good to eat." For a moment, the boy hesitated. Thomas could see the internal struggle playing out on the child's face as hunger battled against learned caution about trusting strangers, especially white ranchers who lived beyond the reservation boundaries. Finally, hunger won. The boy dropped his handful of berries and followed Thomas toward the ranch house, staying several steps behind and ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Sarah Mitchell was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she saw her husband approaching with the Native American child. Her first instinct was surprise, followed quickly by the same compassion that had driven Thomas to help. She could see immediately that the boy was in desperate condition. "Sarah," Thomas called out as they drew near, "this young man needs some food. Can you fix him something?" Sarah's maternal instincts kicked in immediately. She took one look at the child's gaunt appearance and hurried toward the kitchen without saying a word. Within minutes, she had prepared a plate of bread, leftover stew from the previous evening, and a large glass of milk. The boy ate slowly at first, as if he couldn't believe the food was real. Then, as hunger overcame caution, he began eating more quickly, though still with the careful manners of a child who had been well raised despite his current circumstances. Thomas and Sarah watched quietly, both of them moved by the sight of this starving child, finally getting the nourishment he so desperately needed. They didn't ask questions about where he had come from or why he was alone. Those details seemed less important than simply providing immediate help. When the boy had finished eating, he looked up at Thomas and Sarah with gratitude shining in his dark eyes. In halting English, he whispered, "Thank you." Thomas smiled and patted the boy gently on the shoulder. "What's your name, son?" "Joseph," the boy replied quietly. "Well, Joseph, you're welcome here anytime you're hungry. Do you understand?" Joseph nodded, and for the first time since they had met him, a small smile crossed his face. Sarah quickly packed some additional food into a cloth bundle, including more bread, some dried meat, and a jar of preserved fruit. As Joseph prepared to leave, Thomas walked with him back to the fence line. "You be careful out there," he said, "and remember, if you need help, you come back here, day or night." Joseph clutched the food bundle tightly and nodded again before disappearing into the scrub brush that marked the beginning of the reservation lands. Thomas watched until the boy was completely out of sight, then returned to his ranch work, unaware that this simple act of kindness had set in motion a chain of events that would change everything. Joseph Running Bear walked slowly back through the familiar paths that led to his grandmother's dwelling, the precious bundle of food clutched tightly against his chest. Each step brought a mixture of relief and wonder as he replayed the extraordinary encounter at the ranch. Never in his 9 years had he experienced such unexpected kindness from someone outside his tribal community. His grandmother, Running Bear, was waiting anxiously when he finally appeared at the doorway of their small adobe home. She had been caring for Joseph ever since his parents died in a tuberculosis outbreak the previous winter, and the responsibility weighed heavily on her aging shoulders. The drought had made life on the reservation even more difficult than usual, and she often went without food so that Joseph could eat what little they had. When saw the bundle in Joseph's arms, her weathered face creased with concern. "Where did you get this?" she asked in their native language, her voice sharp with worry. She feared that the boy might have taken something that didn't belong to him, which could bring trouble to their family. Joseph's words tumbled out in an excited rush as he described his encounter with the white rancher and his wife. He told his grandmother about the man's gentle voice, the woman's kind eyes, and the incredible meal they had shared with him without asking for anything in return. Listened carefully, her expression shifting from suspicion to amazement as Joseph's story unfolded. She had lived through decades of broken promises and mistreatment from white settlers and government officials. The idea that a rancher would help a Native American child simply out of kindness seemed almost impossible to believe. "Are you certain they asked for nothing?" questioned, examining the generous bundle of food. "No work, no payment, no promises." Joseph shook his head emphatically. "Nothing, grandmother. The man only said I should come back if I was hungry again." That evening, as prepared a proper meal with the food Thomas and Sarah had provided, she found herself deeply troubled by conflicting emotions. Gratitude warred with suspicion, hope battled against years of learned distrust. She had seen too much disappointment to easily believe in the goodness of outsiders. The next morning sought out William Crow Feather, one of the respected elders of their small tribal community. William was known for his wisdom and his ability to see beyond surface appearances to understand the true nature of people and situations. She found him sitting in the early morning shade of an old cottonwood tree, weaving traditional baskets with practiced hands. As approached, she noticed how the drought had affected even this revered elder. His face was drawn with worry, and she knew he was concerned about the welfare of all the families in their community. "William," began respectfully, settling herself on the ground nearby, "I must tell you something strange that happened to my grandson yesterday." William continued his weaving as recounted Joseph's encounter with the rancher. His expression remained neutral throughout her story, but she could see his mind working as he considered the implications of what she was telling him. "This rancher," William said finally, "what was his appearance? How did he carry himself?" Relayed Joseph's detailed description of Thomas Mitchell, including the boy's observations about the man's gentle manner and respectful approach. William nodded slowly, processing this information against his own knowledge of the local ranchers and their varying attitudes toward the tribal community. "There have been rumors about this Mitchell family," William said thoughtfully. "Some say they are different from the others. They do not complain about our people gathering wood near the boundary. They have never filed complaints about our children playing near their fence line." Over the following days, word of Joseph's experience spread quietly through the tribal community. People gathered in small groups to discuss this unexpected development, sharing their own observations and experiences with various local ranchers. Most stories involved conflict or indifference, but a few community members admitted they had noticed the Mitchell family seemed less hostile than others. Maria Lightfoot, a woman whose job cleaning house for various ranchers had given her unique insights into their character, spoke up during one of these gatherings. "I have worked for many families," she said. "Most treat us as invisible, but I cleaned for the Mitchell woman once when she was ill. She spoke to me as a person, not as a servant. She asked about my children and seemed to truly listen to my answers." These conversations reached the ears of Robert Crow Feather, William's son and a leader among the younger generation of tribal members. Robert had been educated at a boarding school and spoke perfect English, but he had never forgotten the hardships his people faced or the injustices they had endured. Robert was skeptical of any apparent kindness from white ranchers, having experienced too many situations where initial friendliness had masked ulterior motives. He decided to investigate the Mitchell family more thoroughly, believing that understanding their true character was important for the safety of the entire community. For several weeks, Robert observed the Mitchell ranch from a distance, watching their daily routines and noting their interactions with anyone who came near their property. He saw Thomas working tirelessly to keep his remaining cattle alive despite the drought. He watched Sarah tending a small garden that was struggling in the harsh conditions. He noticed that they seemed to be facing the same hardships as everyone else in the region. More importantly, Robert observed that the Mitchells never posted additional warnings or barriers along the fence line after Joseph's visit. Many other ranchers had increased their security measures in response to the growing desperation caused by the drought. But Thomas and Sarah seemed unconcerned about potential problems with their Native American neighbors. During his surveillance, Robert also witnessed Thomas helping several other people in need. He saw the rancher provide water to a Mexican family whose wagon had broken down on the nearby road. He watched Thomas share tools with a struggling homesteader who couldn't afford proper equipment. These observations slowly began to convince Robert that the Mitchell family's kindness to Joseph had been genuine. When Robert finally reported his findings to the tribal council, the discussion was long and intense. Some community members remained suspicious, arguing that they should avoid any unnecessary contact with white ranchers regardless of their apparent character. Others believed that acknowledging genuine kindness was important, especially during such difficult times. Elder William Crow Feather listened to all perspectives before speaking his mind. "This family has shown respect for our child," he said gravely. "In our tradition, kindness creates obligation, not the obligation of debt, but the obligation of honor." The council members nodded slowly, understanding the deeper meaning of William's words. In their culture, acts of genuine kindness created bonds that transcended racial and cultural boundaries. If the Mitchell family had truly helped Joseph without expectation of reward, then the tribal community had a moral responsibility to acknowledge and honor that generosity. As autumn approached and the drought continued its relentless hold on the land, the tribal council made a decision that would surprise everyone involved. They would find a way to properly thank the Mitchell family for their kindness to Joseph, and more importantly, they would remember this debt of honor for years to come. The seasons turned slowly in the high desert country, and as the years passed, the relationship between the Mitchell family and their Native American neighbors evolved in ways that neither side could have anticipated. The drought eventually broke, bringing blessed rain that turned the barren landscape green again, but the connections forged during those difficult times only grew stronger. Joseph Running Bear continued to visit the Mitchell Ranch regularly, and what had begun as emergency charity gradually transformed into something much deeper. Thomas taught the boy how to repair fences, care for horses, and read the subtle signs that indicated changes in weather patterns. Sarah shared her knowledge of preserving food, tending gardens, and managing household resources during lean times. For their part, Joseph and his grandmother shared their own expertise with the Mitchell family, taught Sarah about native plants that could provide nutrition and medicine during difficult periods. Joseph showed Thomas traditional methods for finding water sources and reading animal behavior that could predict storms or drought conditions. This exchange of knowledge proved invaluable as the region continued to face periodic challenges. Flash floods, severe winters, and occasional dry spells tested everyone's survival skills, but the combined wisdom of both cultures helped all parties weather these difficulties more successfully than they might have managed alone. Word of this unusual friendship spread beyond the immediate tribal community and began reaching other ranching families in the area. Some viewed the Mitchell family's relationship with their Native American neighbors with suspicion, questioning their motivations and warning of potential trouble. Others, however, began to reconsider their own attitudes and assumptions. By 1947, the Mitchell Ranch had become an informal meeting place where cultural exchange occurred naturally and without fanfare. Thomas and Sarah discovered that many of their preconceptions about Native American life had been completely wrong, while their tribal friends learned that not all white settlers harbored hostile intentions toward indigenous communities. These relationships deepened further when a severe winter struck the region in early 1948. Heavy snows isolated many ranch families for weeks at a time, and several emergencies arose that required cooperation between communities. When Thomas suffered a serious injury while trying to rescue cattle trapped in a frozen creek, tribal members immediately responded to Sarah's call for help. Robert Crow Feather and several other young men arrived at the Mitchell Ranch within hours of receiving word about the accident. They helped transport Thomas to the nearest doctor, assisted with essential ranch work while he recovered, and provided Sarah with emotional support during a frightening time. This incident marked a turning point in the broader relationship between the ranching and tribal communities. Other families began to recognize that cooperation could benefit everyone, especially during emergencies when traditional support networks might be insufficient. Thomas recovered fully from his injuries, but the experience had a profound impact on his perspective. He began attending tribal gatherings when invited, learning about customs and traditions that he had previously known nothing about. Sarah developed close friendships with several tribal women, sharing child-rearing experiences and domestic skills across cultural boundaries. As Joseph grew into adolescence, he became something of a bridge between the two communities. His fluency in both languages and his understanding of both cultures made him a natural mediator when misunderstandings arose. He helped resolve disputes about property boundaries, facilitated trade agreements between tribal craftspeople and local merchants, and served as a translator during important negotiations. The Mitchell Ranch gradually became known throughout the region as a place where different communities could meet on equal terms. Thomas and Sarah never tried to convert anyone to their religious beliefs or impose their cultural values on their Native American friends. Instead, they focused on the practical aspects of survival and mutual support that transcended racial and cultural differences. This approach proved remarkably effective. By the early 1950s, a network of cooperation had developed between several ranching families and the tribal community. Shared resources, combined knowledge, and mutual assistance had made everyone more resilient and prosperous than they had been when living in isolation. The success of these relationships attracted attention from government officials and academic researchers who were interested in understanding how different communities could work together successfully. Thomas and Sarah found themselves hosting visitors who wanted to study their approach to cross-cultural cooperation. However, not everyone approved of these developments. Some local politicians and business interests viewed the growing cooperation with suspicion, fearing that it might interfere with their own plans for land development or resource extraction. Tensions began building as outside pressures threatened to disrupt the peaceful coexistence that had developed naturally over the years. In 1952, a mining company began surveying the region for potential mineral extraction sites. Their activities raised concerns among both ranching and tribal communities, as large-scale mining operations would likely damage water sources, disrupt wildlife patterns, and potentially contaminate agricultural lands. Thomas found himself in an unexpected position as different groups sought his opinion about how to respond to this new threat. His reputation as someone who could work effectively with diverse communities made his voice particularly influential in discussions about how to protect the region's natural resources and traditional way of life. The mining company representatives approached Thomas directly, offering substantial financial incentives if he would support their project and use his influence to convince other community members to cooperate. The amount of money they offered was staggering, easily enough to transform his modest ranch operation into a major enterprise. For weeks, Thomas wrestled with this decision. The financial security would guarantee his family's future and provide opportunities he had never imagined possible. However, Accepting the mining company's offer would almost certainly destroy the relationships and trust that had taken years to build with his Native American neighbors. Sarah supported whatever decision Thomas felt was right, but she made it clear that she valued their current life and the genuine friendships they had developed more than the promise of sudden wealth. Joseph, now a teenager, expressed his hope that Thomas would consider the long-term impact on all the communities that had come to depend on their cooperation. The tribal council also faced pressure from mining company representatives, who offered various forms of compensation in exchange for access to reservation lands. Some community members were tempted by promises of jobs and development, while others feared the environmental and cultural consequences of large-scale industrial activity. Elder William Crow Feather, now quite elderly but still respected for his wisdom, called for a series of meetings between all affected communities to discuss the mining proposal comprehensively. He suggested that decisions of this magnitude required input from everyone who would be affected, not just the immediate landowners. These meetings revealed the depth of connections that had developed over the years between previously separate communities. Ranchers, tribal members, homesteaders, and small business owners discovered they shared common concerns about preserving their way of life and protecting the natural environment that sustained them all. As discussions continued through the summer of 1952, it became increasingly clear that the mining project would fundamentally alter the character of the entire region. The question facing everyone was whether the promised economic benefits were worth the guaranteed social and environmental costs. Thomas realized that his decision about the mining company's offer would affect far more than just his own family. The choice he made would influence the future of all the relationships and communities that had grown from that simple act of kindness toward a hungry child nearly a decade earlier. The autumn of 1952 brought unprecedented challenges to the small desert community that had grown around the Mitchell Ranch. The mining company had grown impatient with the extended discussions and begun applying serious pressure on local officials to approve their project regardless of community opposition. Corporate representatives made it clear that they were prepared to use legal and political means to override local resistance. Thomas Mitchell faced the most difficult decision of his life. The mining company had increased their financial offer to an amount that would secure his family's future for generations. At the same time, he understood that accepting would betray everything he had built with his Native American neighbors over the past 9 years. The answer came to him during a quiet moment while watching Joseph, now 17 years old, helping Sarah with the evening chores. The young man had grown into someone who embodied the best qualities of both cultures, carrying himself with the dignity and wisdom of his tribal heritage while embracing the practical skills and values he had learned at the ranch. Thomas realized that the true wealth he had accumulated over the years could not be measured in dollars. The trust, friendship, and mutual respect that connected these different communities represented something far more valuable than mineral extraction rights or corporate profits. That evening, Thomas called the mining company representatives and firmly declined their offer. He explained that his land was not for sale at any price, and that he would actively oppose any mining operations that threatened the region's water sources or traditional way of life. The mining company's response was swift and harsh. Within days, Thomas received legal documents challenging his property ownership and water rights. Corporate lawyers had discovered technicalities in century-old land grants and territorial agreements that they claimed invalidated current property boundaries. The legal assault was sophisticated and well-funded. Mining company attorneys argued that much of the land currently occupied by ranchers and the tribal community had never been properly transferred from federal ownership. They claimed authority to proceed with mineral extraction regardless of local opposition. Thomas quickly realized that he lacked the resources to fight a prolonged legal battle against corporate lawyers. The mining company could afford to tie up the courts for years, while gradually wearing down individual resistance through financial pressure and legal intimidation. Just when the situation seemed hopeless, Elder William Crow Feather requested a private meeting with Thomas. The old man, now in his 80s but still sharp and determined, arrived at the Mitchell Ranch accompanied by Robert Crow Feather and several other tribal leaders. "Thomas Mitchell," William began in his careful English, "9 years ago you fed a hungry child without asking who he was or where he came from. You showed kindness when you could have shown indifference. You opened your heart when others would have closed their doors. Thomas listened respectfully, unsure where this conversation was heading, but recognizing the formal tone that indicated something important was about to be discussed. In our tradition, William continued, genuine kindness creates bonds that cannot be broken by time or circumstance. You have honored our people, shared your knowledge, and treated us as family. Now we must honor you in return. Robert Crow Feather stepped forward with a leather portfolio containing official documents. These are copies of original treaties signed between our tribe and the federal government in 1848 and 1868, he explained. The mining company's lawyers have made a serious mistake in their research. Thomas examined the documents with growing amazement. The treaties clearly established tribal sovereignty over a much larger area than the current reservation boundaries, including significant portions of the land the mining company claimed to control. These agreements were never formally revoked, Robert explained. The boundaries were reduced through administrative decisions and informal agreements, but the underlying treaty rights remain legally valid. We have been working with legal scholars at the state university to verify our interpretation. William Crow Feather smiled with deep satisfaction. The mining company believes they can take this land through legal tricks and political pressure. They have not considered that we might have stronger legal claims than they do. The tribal council had made a strategic decision that would protect not only their own interests, but also the broader community that had embraced them as neighbors and friends. By asserting their treaty rights, they could block the mining project entirely while strengthening their own legal position for future disputes. Over the following months, the legal battle intensified as the mining company discovered they faced a much more complex situation than they had anticipated. The tribal attorneys, supported by academic experts and civil rights organizations, presented evidence that the proposed mining area fell within territory protected by federal treaties. The case attracted national attention as it raised important questions about corporate power, indigenous rights, and local community autonomy. Environmental organizations joined the legal fight, arguing that large-scale mining would damage fragile desert ecosystems and contaminate water sources used by multiple communities. Thomas found himself testifying before federal judges about the development of cooperation between ranching and tribal communities. He described how mutual respect and shared knowledge had benefited everyone involved, creating a model for successful cross-cultural collaboration that would be destroyed by industrial mining operations. Joseph Running Bear, now a college student studying law with tribal council support, also about his experiences growing up between two cultures. His articulate presentation of the human impact of community cooperation impressed judges and attracted positive media coverage for the coalition opposing the mining project. The legal victory came in the spring of 1953, when federal courts ruled that the mining company lacked proper authority to proceed with their project. The judges determined that tribal treaty rights took precedence over corporate mining claims, and that any future development would require explicit consent from all affected communities. The mining company eventually abandoned their efforts and moved their operations to a different region, leaving the desert communities free to continue their cooperative way of life. The legal precedent established by this case became important for other indigenous communities facing similar corporate pressures. In the years that followed, the Mitchell Ranch remained a symbol of what could be achieved when people chose cooperation over conflict and mutual respect over racial prejudice. Thomas and Sarah lived to see their grow up in a community where cultural diversity was viewed as a source of strength rather than division. Joseph Running Bear became a successful attorney who specialized in indigenous rights and environmental law. He never forgot the lessons he learned about kindness, courage, and community cooperation during his childhood visits to the Mitchell Ranch. The story of how a simple act of feeding a hungry child ultimately saved an entire community from corporate exploitation became legendary throughout the region. Visitors came from across the country to study the cooperative model that had developed naturally from mutual respect and shared challenges. Elder William Crow Feather lived to see his 91st birthday, long enough to witness the mining company's final defeat and the establishment of a formal cooperative agreement between tribal and ranching communities. On his deathbed, he spoke of the Mitchell family's kindness as an example of how individual actions could create ripple effects that changed the world in unexpected ways. Thomas Mitchell passed away peacefully in 1967, surrounded by friends and family from multiple communities who had gathered to honor a man who had chosen compassion over profit and community over personal gain. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by his example of how different cultures could work together for the common good. The desert land that might have been strip-mined and abandoned instead remained a thriving community where children learned traditional skills alongside modern techniques, where different languages were spoken with equal respect, and where the memory of one hungry boy and one generous rancher continued to inspire new generations of cooperation and understanding.